Okay, I think we have about 30 seconds till kickoff time, so I'll just kick off with the introduction so we can get started on time and hopefully finish on time this morning. Just to say again, good morning everybody, and welcome to Fieldfisher's webinar on the Greenification of Road Transport, the Future of Clean Mobility in Europe. My name is Laura Surratt and I am Head of Communications at Fieldfisher with specific responsibility for our International Energy and Natural Resources Group. I'll be introducing the topic this morning and moderating the Q&A session at the end of the presentations. Next slide, please, Jess. Thank you. First of all, let me say thank you very much for joining us on this most interesting and increasingly urgent subject. It's certainly something that's been keeping us at Fieldfisher increasingly busy for a number of years now, and this combined with the fact that many of our clients have wanted to do more cross-border projects in Europe has prompted us to produce this report looking at the regulatory landscape for green transport across the European jurisdictions where we operate. You should have all received a copy of this report, and that will form the basis of our discussion today. We'll try and keep this webinar to an hour, so after a few introductory words from me, we will run through each of our country experts in turn, who will give you a brief overview of the most relevant and we think possibly the most surprising aspects of green road transport legislation and policy in each of the jurisdictions we cover. This will then be followed by a Q&A session, so please, if you have any questions at any point during the webinar, please type them into the chat and we will try to answer them all together in the final portion of the webinar. We'll also be circulating a recording of this session and a write-up of the key themes after the webinar. Plus, if anyone would like a more in-depth discussion or presentation on your particular jurisdiction or area of interest, we're more than happy to organise follow-up sessions. Next slide, please, Jess. As I mentioned, our guide covers key legislation and policy governing green road transport in Europe, both at EU level and at the level of our individual jurisdictions. As many of you will no doubt be aware, the green transport sector is a very rapidly moving target, and even keeping up with policy and legislation is very challenging. So while all the content in the report was correct when it went to press last week, that's not to say things won't have changed by the time this webinar concludes this morning. The other point to note is that despite the best efforts of the EU Commission and the various directives that have been passed and updated and re-updated on green transport over the past decade or so, the pace of development is still very uneven across Europe. So the report reflects this rather patchy nature of the regulatory environment. So not every aspect is covered for every jurisdiction. We do have some common themes emerging, however, which we will touch on today, including the reorientation of policies and financial support away from individual home-based charging towards multi-person dwellings and employer and publicly accessible charging points. There's also more of an emphasis on access to rapid charging, interoperability, and consumer choice and transparency when it comes to payments, data sharing, and price information. We're also seeing infrastructure policy trying to catch up with commercial reality, which has seen vehicle technology surge way ahead of charging capabilities and consequently created quite a few bottlenecks in the delivery of green transport targets. Rather than rehashing the content of the report verbatim today, each of our speakers is going to take 5 minutes to talk through the most significant and perhaps unique aspects of green transport regulation in their jurisdiction, as we thought this would be a better use of this hour than going through the report page by page, which you can read at your leisure. So our speakers today will first hear from David Haverbaker, a partner in our competition and regulatory team specialising in energy and utilities in our Brussels office. And because of where he is consequently extremely well versed in both Belgian and EU developments in the area of green transport. He'll then hand over to Anne-Laure Delus, a competition and regulatory trade partner. She's a litigation partner as well in our Paris office. We'll then move on to Daniel Mahevka, who is corporate partner and co-head of energy and natural resources based in our Munich office. And Daniel deals primarily with financing and financial aspects, but also the full gamut of legal issues affecting clients in renewable energy, clean technology and infrastructure. We'll then hand over to Elaine Trainer, a corporate partner specialising in energy in our Dublin office, and then to Louis Bouchez, who is a corporate partner in Amsterdam. We'll then hear from Ramon Vasquez del Rey Villanueva, a public and regulatory law partner in Madrid, and finally to Miguel Vaz, another public and regulatory competition law specialist based with us in London. I should say that we don't have a speaker from Italy with us this morning, although there is a section on Italy in the report. So if you are interested in the Italian market, please let us know and we'll very happily put you in touch with our Italian team. As you can see, we're very corporate and regulatory law heavy on this webinar this morning, but we have the full complement of technology, IP, finance, real estate, disputes lawyers on standby who all have experience in this area if you require any input on any of these aspects. With that, I'll ask Jess to move on to the next slide, please, and hand over to David to talk us through the key points of greenification of road transport and policy in Belgium. David.
Thank you, Laura, for these introductory words. So, well, let's start with Belgium. And you can move to the next slide, I think, Jessica. What I will do in the coming 5 minutes is highlight a number of specificities proper to Belgium. There will be 3 of them, one more, say, constituting a barrier to the deployment of charging infrastructure, electric vehicles. The second one will be about support, subsidy schemes, tax measures. And the third element would be, say, food for further thought and a link with other segments of the energy market. So if you start with the first one, what you see there is an Italian dish. It's a lasagna because we have in Belgium a institutional particularity, which is that as a federal state, we have a division of competencies between the federal level and the regional levels. We have 3 regions in Belgium. And so, well, as a rule of thumb, think about federal state being competent for base load generation, a large infrastructure, for example, transmission networks, but also for tax measures and tax rebates, fiscal measures. While at regional level, you will encounter the competencies of town and planning aspects. So as soon as a permit, as soon as an authorization for building your charging infrastructure will be required, you will be speaking to regional authorities. We also think about distribution of electricity. We all know that charging infrastructure is largely taking place at distribution level, say with a lower voltage. And also there you will be speaking with distribution network operators, all governed by regional regulatory authorities. So the first point to take when you are thinking about entering the Belgian market for your investments in charging infrastructure, or electrical or green mobility, will be to either search or get help and proper guidance on which stakeholders you will have to meet, because all that is not as simple as it might look. That is the first point. Jessica, please, next slide. The second point, which we believe deserves attention, is guiding you through, well, a summary, evidently, of what here is being organized for supporting, say, helping the development of infrastructure relevant to green mobility. So in terms of subsidies, charging infrastructure will be largely benefiting from tax deductibility. You can see the figures there. When you are investing as a company, as a professional user into charging infrastructure, you can go to 200% of tax deductibility with a number of requirements. We've summarized them there. It has to be new charging infrastructure. That will not be very surprising. It has to be publicly accessible. That is a requirement, specific requirement. So 24/7 public accessibility to the infrastructure. And then, well, what is called intelligent infrastructure should use what is called the best available technologies when you think in terms of smart metering or any other type of smart devices. So you will there plunge into the regional requirements of what is intelligent, what is smart, to make sure you can benefit from the federal tax measures, and a number of residential measures as well, but I will skip those for the sake of time. When you think about electrical vehicles, we have this new measure adopted last year, which imposes, or which will allow for tax deductibility of cars as in most of other European countries, professional companies, so enterprises purchasing or leasing cars for the sake of their employees, usually were fully tax deductible. This will change with a horizon of 2026, whereby it will only be emission-free vehicles. So imagine electric vehicles or hydrogen geared vehicles. Only those will benefit as from that date from tax deductibility. So you can imagine the change in mentality or the change in fleet strategy, all that is gearing with companies and enterprises. In terms of licensing, in terms of permitting, the big principle is that when you are using a charging infrastructure with the idea to supply electric vehicles, you will not need the classic electricity supply license. So that is, we believe, a big. It is, by the way, directly derived from the desire, I would say, from of the European framework. We can come back later on during the Q&A. But so the big permit support that has been organized here is a structural exemption of electricity supply licenses when the supply relates to electric vehicles via charging infrastructure. Same thing for direct lines, for CDS, stands for closed distribution systems, there as well. When it relates to charging infrastructure and to electric vehicles, there will be a number of exemptions. So it is a partial or total relief of permitting requirements. Then maybe the third, next slide, please, Jessica. So third and last point is a more food for thought, is how does this deployment relate to other segments of the energy markets? We think about one in particular we see developing fast in Belgium is flexibility services, FSPs, flexibility service providers, starting to use the flexibility pool, I would say, the potential, the substantial source of flexibility, which is intrinsically inherent to electric vehicles. So the idea is to, including via price signals, favor the pooling of the flexibility, so the ability to adapt consumption to the needs of the grids via the electric vehicles that would be charging at some point. And so it's a whole new world, both for grid operators as for those flexibility service providers who traditionally were more geared to balancing services like containment and reserves. But so there we see a number of market operators into the flexibility services using the fast increasing amount of electrical vehicles, use that pool to market, to valorize the flexibility. So it is more than an opportunity. It's a start of a new market segment, which we are witnessing and which we will be happy to further help any one of you. I think that's it for sake of time. And I would be I'm very happy to hand over to Anne-Laure Desilous, our Paris-based partner for the highlights of the French market. Anne-Laure, please.
Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, David, and all of you. I'm always very happy to participate to this kind of webinar, which we can see that we are wool firm in our different offices. And on my side, I have also Marie-Léonie Vernery, who is the partner specialized in environmental law in Paris, and we are a real team dedicated to this energy group, and this is why we have worked together on this presentation. So next slide, please, Jessica. Thank you very much. So my interest for this subject started with the first decision of the French Competition Authority, which is not very, which is quite recent because it was last year, and it was the first decision that was dedicated to the delimitation of the market of charging network for EV electric vehicles. So I think the main purpose of my presentation will be that everything is quite new, even if as it is most of the time the case for new subjects, there are many laws that have been dedicated to this question. So back to 7 years ago, we have started with the law for energy transition and green growth, and in this law, dated August 2015, so it was already decided that the French legislator want to promote EV use, and for that they decided to set the objective of reaching 7 million of EV charging points by 2030, and impose the obligation to renew the public fleets with a minimum proportion of low emission vehicles. So very strong objective for the next 15 years after this law. Basically, we are at the middle of this period, and the French legislator probably realized that this law was not supportive enough, so they have decided to take another law. So in December 2019, new objective with more constraint on companies and on the objective that has been defined through this law. So now in this new law, the objective was to set of multiplying by 5 the number of public EV charging points by 2022, so this year, and requires non-residential car parks with more than 10 spaces in new or renovated buildings to be pre-equipped for charging points. So again, very high-level objectives in order to develop this new market, new technology, and of course transition to organize the transportation for public everywhere in France. And again, it was not maybe enough, because we had this third law, and of course, which has also included the European objective, with 3 main objectives for the transport sector. First, promote the use of clean vehicles for everybody. Second, improve road freight transport. So it's out of our scope for today, but it's important to say. And again, another objective, which is out of the scope, but it's very important, which is to limit emission from aviation sector. So other way to promote EV transportation. Next slides, please. So, and as David has outlined, the other way to promote the development of EV vehicles and EV transportation is to fix obligation for companies. Either public and private companies. So first of all, the fleet renewal, which we know that is very important for companies. So the fleet renewal is to be for every 100 vehicle fleet must, when they renew each year, to acquire and use low emission vehicles in a minimum proportion of 10% this year, 20% in 2 years, 40% in 5 years, and 70% in 8 years. So, you know, again, always this kind of way to develop the market is to fix some objective with a period of time. Now it's directly on the company, and with a very strong incentive as well. And we know that also they have fixed some installation of charging point requirement by January 2025. Next slide, please. And the other way to, of course, develop this kind of activity is to give subsidies, exactly like in Belgium, and to give incentive for companies. So basically, a lot of incentive has been created to purchase or to lease of low emission vehicles. So you can see that it's quite a lot of money in order to really foster this kind of vehicle. And again, also very important, the installation of charging points that has been granted to companies to finance this kind of installation, because as you know, we need to develop public network of charging points, but also private network of charging points. So we can see that both are really focused to meet the objective for 2030, the objective of the first law which has been voted in France. So this was in a summary, I think the most important development of French law. But of course, as we have prepared it with Marie-Léonie, we have a more extensive presentation of the situation in France related to transportation in our rule documentation we have all prepared, thanks to all the team. Thank you. And now I can let the next person speaker to Daniel. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Yes, thank you very much for attending the webinar. In Germany, I think we're not only a car and automotive country, as is probably known. We're also very famous for a lot of laws that we develop and put into work. The issue here is that we talk about greenification of transport as such, automotive, the automotive region. There are a lot of different fragmented regulatory framework in Germany, so it's not that easy to have that in 5 minutes that we have for the specific countries. So I'll try to give you a political framework and the most important steps on a few topics. I think we also have a very special situation in Germany since we have a new government since last December, in which the Green Party is very strong. So if you look at the new coalition agreement, we have very big targets. However, I would have assumed in December that we would have seen until June right now already a strong development in Germany, a lot of new regulations and a new incentives in that area. As you all know, there have been other things that have occupied the government until now. So a lot of those topics have not been put into operation yet. Next slide, please. In Germany, we have the Climate Change Program 2030, which is still from the old government, which sets an emission reduction target of 55% compared to the 1990 situation until 2030. And of that reduction, the transport sector shall have a 48% reduction until 2030. And electrification, especially of road transport, is essential to achieve those targets. In order to implement those targets, various requirements have been identified in the automotive sector, development and distribution, electric vehicle charging infrastructure, public and private, and biofuels. with a special, I think, a special emphasis on green hydrogen. In our eyes, the more currently the most active fields or the more interesting fields are EV charging infrastructure, because that is probably the biggest work that has to be done. And hydrogen, however, in the framework we have at the moment, we will focus on, especially on the EV charging infrastructure. And of course, there all the other aspects are dealt with in the paper that you have received, that we've prepared. Next slide, please. So the German government developed something which is called Masterplan and StandortTOOL, the location tool, which is part of the climate change program 2030, and has some development targets, and especially expanding the public and non-public charging points in Germany for EVs. So the targets are 50 million EVs and 1 million public charging points by 2030. We had in Germany totally EVs of 618,500 in January 22, and a total of 58,900 charging points at that time. So the target means until 2030 we have to have almost 2 million new EVs a year and almost 125,000 more charging points a year, which is tripling what we have at the moment each year. So it's interesting how that will be. I would more call it ambitious targets than actual strategy, because I don't see the strategy to achieve that at the moment. Then another part is around 10,000 fast charging points at 1,000+ locations in Germany, because that's identified as one of the main drivers of transition to EVs. If you can go long ways and have fast charging points available, every fast charging point should be reachable, or there should be a reachable fast charging point in 10 minutes. That's part of the situation. Then there was developed a location tool which shows where the expansion works and where it doesn't work. You have those little maps that you see. 2020, everything is still green, but 2030, the demand is shown in red, where most new charging points will be required. From an investment point of view, the German government will invest up to 2 billion from October 21 to 22. That means that in tender proceedings, they will grant for certain applications investments in that amount, and they have a concept called Deutschlandnetz, so Germany grid, or Germany network, which has 3 main objectives. They shall take into account the existing market, prevent monopolies, and enable also medium-sized companies to take part in those tenders. Next slide, please. So in the tenders, which have been like the kickoff for the public investment and also the state investment in the development of the EV charging structure, not only the price which are bid in the tenders is relevant, but also accessibility, performance, reliability, user-friendliness, and environmental compatibility. So there was one of those tenders in October 21, which ended January 22. And there was another one started in December 21 and ended in January 20 as well, in end of January 22. So those are the 2 tenders which have already taken place and are finalized. There have been more than 400 applications in those tenders. There's still not a result of those tenders. They're still in the review at the moment. we assume that there will be many more of those, given the targets that I've described earlier, and also the language in the coalition agreement. But as I said, that has not been announced now yet. So next slide, please. So with regard to the EV charging infrastructure, I think that there are three different things which are important. Public charging infrastructure, then the company sector and domestic sector. And I think one of the main drivers is especially the subsidies system that we have in place. Besides those tenders that I've just described, there are other incentives or other subsidies which are existing in Germany. So we have other subsidies for publicly accessible charging infrastructure, which is 500 million until 2025. The first two funding calls took already place for those for this subsidy amount. Then we have a specific program for charging infrastructure on site, which means especially supermarkets or other infrastructure where restaurants, sport fields, where people don't have residential access to charging possibilities can charge their electric vehicles. That's a 300 million program started July 21. 2,500 applications have been entered in until then, until end of 21, which was the end date of that, so 130 million. So it's not totally spent, but the deadline has expired. We assume that the new government will initiate a new program soon, which is not yet there. And then also a mobility and fuel strategy, 268 million since 2009 already, which more or less finances regional projects at a local government level. Next slide, please. So private charging infrastructure, which is also which is dealt with in other countries a lot, also with tax subsidies. In Germany, we have here additional, again, a 551 million subsidy regime until 2025, which supports especially vehicles with high mileages, installation of charging points on municipality and commercial fleets, especially. So far, around 13,000 charging points have been financed by this subsidy, and we have also a program for non-publicly accessible charging stations, which has a volume of 350 million, especially interested for also companies and municipalities with certain subsidy requirements there, and we have certain aims for federal government set by the federal government for trolleys and trolley trucks and fuel cell cars. Next slide, please. One before that, thank you. Last but not least, the domestic sector. There have been some changes introduced. Residential Property Modernization Act, which simplifies but also requires the expansion of charging infrastructure in new build buildings, and the Building Electric Mobility Infrastructure Act, which does the same for buildings, the required infrastructure for buildings, but also improvements in existing buildings. And of course, we have many other subsidies on a local level, which can be applied for. So that's more or less a quick overview of the important EV charging sector, grid sector. There are, of course, many other aspects that you can find in the paper that we've published, and we're also very happy if you have any questions in that regard to help you with that. So I hand over to Elaine to Ireland, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. So just a quick 5-minute look at greenification of transport in Ireland. So just Jessica on slide number 2, the next slide. A lot of the legislative developments in Ireland are very recent, and we've had some key recent developments. The primary piece of legislation in Ireland is really the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Amendment Act of 21, which was developed in tandem with our Climate Action Plan, or CAP 2021. And this really places an obligation on our local authorities here to prepare individual climate action plans and to take account of them in the performance of their functions. It provides for the approval of plans by the government to pursue a transition to climate resilient and a climate neutral economy by 2050. It's a very ambitious plan and sets some very high targets, as we will see as we go through the slides. In terms of EVs specifically, we have the recent Energy Performance of Buildings Regulations 21, which I will look at briefly below, and the Road Traffic Amendment Personal Light Vehicles Bill, which hasn't yet been enacted but is currently before the Oireachtas here. In relation to biofuels, we have the Biofuel Obligation and Miscellaneous Provisions Act, which again I'll just look briefly at below. Some of the key fiscal incentives, similar to some that we've heard in other jurisdictions in relation to vehicles, the Sustainable Energy Authority in Ireland provides grants of up to €5,000 for private individuals and about €4,000 for businesses towards the purchase of EVs, and that's working quite well in Ireland at the moment. In relation to charging infrastructure, we have grants of up to €5,000 for public charging points and €600 for home charging equipment. We also have discounted motor tax and tolls for EVs and PHEVs. Just on the next slide, please, Jessica, just to look at the CAP, the Climate Action Plan, in some more detail. As I said, it sets some very ambitious targets. It targets getting nearly 1 million EVs on the road by 2030. And just to put our progress into perspective, in Ireland, there were 41,000 EVs and PHEVs on Irish roads at the end of last year, so we have some way to go. Looking at some of that legislation in more detail, the Energy Performance of Buildings Regulations 21 provides for EV charging points are now required in all new buildings in Ireland and buildings undergoing renovation that have more than 10 parking spaces, so this will be a mandatory requirement. As regards existing buildings with 20+ parking spaces, there will be a mandatory requirement to have a minimum number of charging points installed by 2025. In terms of charging infrastructure in Ireland, at present, I think it's fair to say that we have a very long way to go. We have some 2,000 public EV charging points installed at present, and we need about 30,000 public charging points to reach our decarbonisation goals for transport by 2030. Most of our charging points are also clustered in urban areas and don't tend to be located in more rural areas. Decarbonisation of public transport has been recognised as being key in Ireland to achieving the CAP objectives. So to achieve a 51% reduction in emissions by 2030, as set out in CAP, it is vital that we have a sustainable, reliable and convenient public transport system. So the government has set a target of 500,000 more public transport and active travel journeys per day by 2030. We've also set a goal of increasing the number of passenger EVs from 2,000 in 2018 to 800,000 in 2030. So we, again, have a huge way to go. We have a target of 1,500 public transport EVs by 2030, with 800 EV buses being procured. And this is, I mean, trialling is significantly underway at the moment, but I think, again, it's probably not moving at the pace that it needs to be. Just moving on to the last slide, looking at some projected changes. As I mentioned, the road traffic personal light vehicles bill is before the Oireachtas at the second stage at the moment, and this is intended to regulate the use of personal light EVs such as electronic scooters. We have had an annual increase in biofuel obligations in Ireland, so oil companies must now meet the obligation that about 15% of the motor fuel they place on the market in Ireland is produced from renewable sources, and this is an increase on the previous 12% in 2021. So looking quickly at some recommended actions in Ireland, as I said, we have a huge amount of work to do in terms of EV charging infrastructure. 30,000 public EV charging points are required by 2030. We also need to look closely at pricing measures. CAP envisages that EVs will reach the cost of parity with ICE vehicles by the mid-2020s. I'm not sure if that's really happened as of yet. And we need to look at further increased biofuel obligations and the trialling more seriously of hydrogen as a fuel source. So that's really just a very quick overview of the Irish position. So I will hand you over to Louis in Amsterdam.
Thank you, Elaine. My name is Louis Boucher. I will guide you through some of the recent developments in the Netherlands. Jessica, can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. First, I'll tell something about key regulations, and then I will tell you something about the incentive schemes, and I will finish with some words about infrastructure. In the Netherlands, in terms of regulation, the most important change for EV has been the adoption of the 2019 Climate Act, which sets the goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 49% compared to 1990. And in 2050, this should be reduced by 95%. This is an ambitious target. And for that reason, the government has reached out to the industry. And on that basis, also in 2019, the climate agreement was agreed between public and private sector stakeholders, including the electricity branch, but also the industry, transport and agriculture sectors. And this climate agreement is key for the Netherlands to achieve the targets, because it has created a support base throughout the entire society. If we look at electric vehicles, this is the most regulated part of the ambitious scheme. There's quite some regulation at lower levels as well. Important takeaways are that in 2030, all new vehicles in the Dutch market should be emission-free, and the focus here, like with our hydrogen vehicles, is on safety, and that's the big difference between electric and hydrogen vehicles, because electric vehicles are already part of the landscape in the Netherlands, while hydrogen vehicles are really in the preliminary phase, which has to do with the lack of a solid policy framework. So this is really for the government to pick up. They're working on it. They've published their hydrogen vision in 2020, but there's no tangible legislation or regulation which gives good incentives for the markets to develop hydrogen vehicles. The last point in this context is about biofuels. This has been a topic since 2015, and fuel suppliers in the Dutch market have to comply with certain numbers of their fuels which they bring on the market. Certain percentages need to be biofuels, which also helps to develop a greener transport sector. Next slide, please. This brings us to the incentive schemes in the Netherlands. There's a long-standing investment scheme for environmental friendly investments. This is going back already for about 20-25 years. It's very successful, and it provides companies for a beneficial write-off plan pursuant to which they can get tax benefits for investments in environmental friendly production installations, for example, which is typically applicable on manufacturing of electric vehicles. Moreover, there's a large scheme of subsidies in place at different levels, again from the government. The most popular one is the one for private individuals to acquire an electric vehicle. But also there are also schemes in place for the construction and manufacturing of zero emission buses, and also for companies there's a scheme for emission-free company cars. At the local level, we also see subsidy schemes. For example, the Amsterdam municipality has a scheme for acquiring electric taxis, and that's the reason why you see those if you arrive at Schiphol Airport or at the train station in Amsterdam. You will see all the taxis being Teslas. That's not because the taxi drivers are so rich, but it's due to the incentive scheme. And then, of course, there are also direct tax incentives, and again, the most popular one being the one for acquiring a full electric car, which for private individuals, those people are tax exempt, at least for the car tax. They are exempt, and that scheme has just been extended to 2024. Jessica, can you do the next slide, please? Yeah, that brings me to the infrastructure, which is a challenge in the Netherlands, because the Netherlands, as you may know, is one of the most densely populated countries in the world, and there's a lot of pipelines and electricity networks in the ground. So this is really a challenge for in particular for the government. So this is a very heavily regulated part of the industry. In order to get or to develop an appropriate further infrastructure policy, a public-private partnership has been established called the Formula E team, and they provide the government with advice on how to do this. It must be said that the Netherlands has been, or at least the industry has been fast with developing this infrastructure, because there's one company called Fastnet, and they have arranged for a network of infrastructure along all the big auto car routes in the Netherlands, and they are also expanding to Belgium, Germany, and France at this moment. It's a listed company, very successful. Apart from that, in particular the charging points in public areas, so in parking spaces, that has been a point of attention for the government, and they have set targets to increase the numbers there. And importantly, in 2021, charging station operators are now obliged to share the data with the users who use their infrastructure, and this is intended to facilitate modernizing the industry further. And yeah, that brings me to sort of the concluding challenging points for the Netherlands, which is in particular in the infrastructure, because currently in particular the high voltage network is yeah, there's too much traffic, so there's a need for huge investments over there, and also at the distribution level, and that's all needed in order to facilitate the greenification of the transport industry. I mentioned before the hydrogen policy is another challenge for the Dutch policy makers, as well as the development of the battery industry, which is also just at the starting point in the Netherlands. Finally, there has been a new government in place since about half a year, and they have just created a 35 billion euro fund targeted for the climate and transition fund, and it's interesting to see how this will develop and what tangible actions this new fund will indeed create. So having said so, I'm happy to transfer the wording to Ramon Nicolas Vasquez. Ramon, you tell us about Spain. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luis. Happy here to talk about the Spain framework on the regulatory deployment regarding EVs. Well, here I'm the partner of Public Regulatory and Phil Fisher here in the Madrid office. And yes, if you can go on with the next slide, please. Okay, the first point I would like to trade is the regulatory scheme. And as the other jurisdiction here in Spain, we have the PNIEC, is the Spanish National Integrated and Climate Change. And he have also big goals to reach for by 2030. We're talking about 5 million of EVs, and in an intermediate goal of 1,010 public charging points in Spain just for 2023. No? But this is very ambitious, and in order to achieve these goals, the Spanish government has passed some regulations. The first of all is the Climate Change Act of 2021, and this regulation said that fuel or diesel fuel station must meet the following requirements depending on their sales volumes in 2019. You have there depending on the sales, and you have to point, and you have to implement a recharging point depending on the daytime current and the power, and you have there a commission date. And this is a legal obligation for all the operators. Since 20 and 21, owners of new fuel station or those who upgrade their fueling station must install at least one EV charging point with that power of 50 kV DC. Another effort for lift all the barriers on the deployment of the infrastructure EVs is the streamlining administrative procedures regarding that. There is very fluent proceedings just to get an authorization in public roads. No local, no municipality permit is required. This is very important because here in Spain, the town halls and the town councils are very slow in their granting of license. Of course, there is obligation for non-residential buildings. I'm talking about private parkings and public parkings. For example, in public parkings, depending on the state of the administrative buildings, you have to distinguish between parkings with less of 500 spaces. You have to put on one or charging point for each 20, and if the if the parking have more or has more of 500 spaces, you have to put one charging point for 100. More aggressive requirements are for private parkings. You have also here a new regulation of the recharging services regulation, and you have to distinguish several actors, several players, like the operator of the recharging point, the users, the supplier, and the electric mobility provider. They are different players with different rights and obligations. And as in the Netherlands was talked before, we have here not a share of data, but an official map of recharging points, just to facilitate for all the users to know where is our recharging point, because as is usual, this is the main trouble or the main barrier for the deployment of the EVs. And then we have also a new regulation of tolls and charges in this CNMC, the Spanish competition regulator, and also ministerial order that that establishes several frame of time, several valid and hot times, just in order to put higher price to the supply of electricity. So yes, you can go ahead with the next. But we have here new regulations in progress. I'm talking about the draft of law sustainable mobility, and according to the draft, companies with more than 500 employees must develop plans for sustainability mobility to work, facilitating the use of EV. New services are just for renewables sources in airports and also in ports, and sandboxes, just a place to test new technology regarding battery, hydrofuels, hydrogen, and all these things. Talking about incentives, we have here to point out the Spanish recovery and resilience plans that has generated two parts. Part is a public and private collaboration project, a very strategic project, and we have here the PERTE BEC, is the PERTE of electric vehicle, with that very important amount of money, you know, just for loans and just for grants. But in these competition procedures, at least 30% have to be focused on small and medium enterprises, and they are focusing in manufacturing, original equipment, assembly, fuel cell batteries, and connectivity, and must contribute to Spain's circular economy. And yes, you want to go ahead with the next slide, please. Thank you. We have also not only the PERTE BEC, but also the PERTE hydrogen and storage and renewables, and here the amount is quite higher. Focus on electric buses and trucks, and subsidies to local administration and authority, just to change all their fleets. We have also, beside this PERTE, we have several plans, incentive plans, and moves 2, moves 3, moves singular project, and moves fleet, that they are always trying to subsidy the acquisition. I'm not talking about manufacturing, but acquisition of EV. And last, we have a new regulation just passed in June of 2022 regarding hydrogen warranties of origin. That is very important, just to kick off all this merchant. And last, a quick view to tax. We have all these incentive regarding property tax, economy activity tax, construction tax of the recharging points, and bonus of 70% on vehicle ownership tax, and of course we have also personal discount in our personal tax. And that's all. I'm happy to attend any query regarding Spain, and of course hand over Miguel. Go ahead with the UK regulations.
Thank you, Ramon. And given that we're almost on the hour, I'll try to keep in topic and be lightning fast in my presentation. So next slide, please, Jessica. So I'll start by presenting you what I think is the UK market at the moment. I mean, there's quite a lot of significant potential in EV development. I don't want to rub it in our German or French colleagues' face, but we're still the second largest automotive manufacturing hub in Europe, with a comparatively large consumer base for road vehicles. As you can see in the right-hand side of my slide, there has been a considerably large uptake in the purchase of plug-in hybrid and battery electric vehicles over the past around about 3 years. There's also a good wealth of innovation, with Nissan Leaf being produced here, with Dyson putting also quite a lot of money into battery research and electrical vehicle charging points. We tend to have business-friendly governments with light touch regulation, specifically on innovative markets, which is particularly encouraging. And there is also, like in many other jurisdictions that spoke before me, a quite ambitious plan, which is a government 2035 delivery plan on how to transition into cleaner energies, and in particular around electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging points. So next slide, please, Jessica. So this is the timeline that the government is intending to achieve. I'm not going to go into detail on every single point. I'll probably focus rather on the sort of near-term sort of goals, which is to create a sort of far-reaching EV charging infrastructure strategy. There will be further consultation on the CO2 regulatory regime, including the design of a ZEV mandate on manufacturers, and the launch of the local electric vehicle infrastructure fund. In the end, the final sort of objective is that by 2035, and there are discussions around pushing forward this goal, so to around 2025 to 2030, that all new cars and vans to be 100% zero emissions at the tailpipe. Next slide, please. So in a nutshell, I think the key sort of legislative incentives that we currently have in place are the Electric Vehicle Regulation 2021, which basically focuses on smart charge points. It entered into force fairly recently on the 30th of June 2022, and it sets out minimum standards for whole home and workplace charging points sold in England, Scotland, and Wales from that date. There's also amendments to the building regulations, and again, in line with many other jurisdictions, this will require new homes and non-residential developments built after June 2022 to include EV charging points. There's also incentives for consumers, and this is mostly along the lines that you've heard as well. So exemption from road tax, reduction in tolls, and as well home charging point grant schemes. On corporations, there's also quite a number of grants, voucher-based schemes, and direct funding from the government. Again, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I would probably highlight the local electric vehicle infrastructure fund, which is a quite large fund of £450 million, open to applications for local authorities, partnerships, and consortiums planning EV charging infrastructure projects that supports transitions to EV use in certain local areas. Next slide, please. And just to close, I would just remind our audience of the key entities that will run not only the regulatory developments, but also the implementation of all that and disbursement of the funds. So Ofgem is probably the most prominent Office for Gas and Electricity Markets, and it's our UK electricity regulator, which will have a quite large role in reviewing existing license conditions for transmission, distribution, generation, and supply, to ensure the removal of existing barriers to development of electric vehicles and their supporting infrastructure. Obviously, also network owners and operators, and in particular here, the national grid as transmission system owner and operator, will have to work closely with DNOs to ensure that investment in developing and reinforcing the networks is deployed at the most efficient way. And obviously, this will be a particularly challenging task for electric vehicles, which might not have predictable demand and in terms of the points at which they call on networks. Electricity market participants will also have to be fairly coordinated. Specifically, electricity generators, suppliers, and distributors will have to work together with network owners to ensure vehicular demand for electricity is managed, specifically at crunch demand times during the day. And finally, charging station developers, and here with a particular connection to the Competition and Market Authority, just to make sure that the new charging infrastructure, including POD points, Charge Master, EV charging solutions, and ROLEC, are likely to face competition and are fairly aligned, and ensuring that consistent level of compatibility and interoperability between the charging points. And that brings me to a very, very quick overview of the UK market, and I'll pass it on to the moderator so that we can go into closing remarks. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Miguel. Sorry you had to rattle through that so quickly, and thank you to all of our speakers for that whistle-stop tour of the legislative landscape for green road transport in Europe. We have run over time, and I think that was our fault. We were a bit too ambitious in fitting this very complicated and big topic into the space of an hour across as many jurisdictions as we did. We have had a clutch of very interesting questions come in. In the interest of time, I think what I will do is I will very quickly read out these questions, and I will get our speakers to submit written answers so that we can circulate the answers to the questions in writing along with the write-up of today's discussion. I think that will be the best policy. So the questions we've had in, what are the main contractual and liability issues in respect of charging point installation / operation that we have seen so far? What types of disputes have we seen or do we foresee arising between charging point operators and landowners? Just on that point, I don't think we've seen many fully litigated disputes in this area yet, but these will come, so that's an interesting point for us to address. There's a question about the finite capacity of grids. Have you had any experience of DNOs rationing provision of EV charging points / supply to chargers to suit available capacity? And what is your advice for developers of charging point infrastructure in negotiating with DNOs in these circumstances? I know that's an issue that's come up in the UK. What enforcement measures exist to ensure property owners comply with their obligations to install charging points? That's another good point. We heard a lot today about the obligations on building owners to include charging points per number of charging spaces, but what happens if they don't do that? This is a question about competition. Late last year, the UK's Competition and Markets Authority announced that it would not enforce the exclusive rights of motorway service operators to provide EV charging, and it said it would allow third-party CPOs the right to install charging points. So have there been similar decisions in other European jurisdictions, and what is the position there? And then finally, a very general question about what policy developments we can expect from the EU in terms of green road transport. So we're waiting for, I think, for legislation on the revision of biofuels classifications. You've probably all seen in the news recently, there's been a lot of discussion around the use of food crops for biofuels and whether that's going to be reclassified. Competition law issues, which we've already mentioned, more legislation on hydrogen, as I think Louis in particular referred to. There's a bit of a gap in the market when it comes to regulating hydrogen. Also batteries and data privacy for charging networks are other areas where we're waiting for more EU guidance. In the UK, we're expected to follow, I think, where the EU leads on that, although we will of course be making our own laws in that area. So we will wrap up there. Thank you again to everyone for attending, and apologies for running over time. As I also mentioned at the beginning, and I will reiterate, if you have any specific questions on your particular jurisdiction or questions on anything we haven't addressed here, please get in touch with us or with your local country expert, and we'd be very happy to provide you with more information. Thank you again to everyone, and have a great summer. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.